hopefully I tested everything yesterday, but I'm not sure if it's going to work. But hopefully, fingers crossed, get through it. And secondly, I understand we have like quite a small room today, so if anyone has any questions just throughout the presentation, just feel free to holler out, because I will just be running through the code and I'll be introducing a few concepts. And yeah, if there's anything that's not clear or you feel you need more context on, feel free to ask then and not at the end of the presentation, because I think the questions that you have most likely other people have as well.
Feel free to sit closer, guys, because I know that the code's a bit small.
Yeah. All right.
I'll be looking at the chat in the Zoom.
Ah, sweet. All right. So maybe before we start, I understand from James that a lot of you here are seeking help on deploying your IT project, I guess, onto the internet.
Yeah.
How are you guys currently thinking of doing it? And then we can discuss maybe a few pros and cons, and then we can hopefully like give everyone a bit more context as to why deploying it via S3 and CloudFront, and how that can compare with the current methods that you guys have in your mind. No one? All right. All good. So I'll run through a few solutions that maybe most likely some of you guys may explore. So I guess in the most basic way, as we all know, if you're deploying anything onto the web, you need a server to host your web page, right? So the easiest way, if we're talking in the context of EC2 and AWS, is you'd just really be opening up an EC2 server, chucking your code on there, and then getting your node server to serve a web page, and your I guess when you access that URL, your web page will get served. And so that's at the core of the most basic way of doing it, right? It's like the same thing as serving a web page on a computer. It's just you're doing it in the web via an EC2 instance. There are various shortcomings to that, as you know. So if someone, say you have like 1,000 requests a second, your server will blow up. So there are these managed solutions called platform as a service. So there's stuff like Elastic Beanstalk, which manages the auto scaling for you. I think the most easiest one to set up is probably Heroku, which some of you guys may or may not know. If you guys are doing an IT project, that's the one that I recommend, because it's basically integrated with the React app application. It's like one line of code for you to deploy your code into the cloud. Again, there are shortcomings around that because you don't get as much flexibility around the different configurations. And so, and also it's managed, so it gets very costly very fast as you have more requests coming in. And so lastly, what I want to introduce today is so CloudFront and S3. So just to raise a hand, does everyone know what S3 and CloudFront is, or should I get into a bit more context around that? Yeah, no? All right. So S3 is an object store. So you can kind of think of this as like, I guess, your hard drive, right? So it's like a hard drive in the cloud. That's the simplest way to think of it. And it's distributed, so you can just chuck whatever you want there: images, text, videos, whatever. And CloudFront is a edge. It's a CDN. So it's a cloud content delivery network. So essentially, what happens is if you only have, say, to give you an example, if you have an EC2 instance hosted in Australia and you have someone accessing your EC2 instance from America, that round trip time is going to be probably 150 milliseconds. So that's not going to be good user experience, right? So they have to wait for a long time to even get the request back. So what a CDN does is it caches your content at edge locations. So for example, maybe in America, there is an edge location there. And then so if you're accessing the web page from America, you're going to get kind of routed to the closest edge location. And the round trip time is probably going to be less than 10 milliseconds. And also there's various other things that the CDN does, but just I guess at a high level, that's what it does. Like it distributes your content throughout the whole world, hence content delivery network. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna be hosting our React application onto S3, all right? And then we're going to be using CloudFront in conjunction with S3 to distribute our application throughout the world on AWS network. And yeah, so I'm gonna get started. So the first thing that we will be doing is setting up the infrastructure. So as we know, we need to be deploying this onto AWS, but we have nothing set up in AWS right now, right? So we need to set up our S3 bucket, CloudFront caching, so all the things that we need to run our application. Has anyone heard of this term called infrastructure as code? Yes? No? All right. Actually, I'll take a step back. Has anyone played with any cloud provider before? No? Yes? No? Maybe so? There is usually when if you guys go and play with AWS, which I highly recommend you do, they have this, actually I can show you guys right now. So they have this they have a console here, right? And in this console here, you know, there's like hundreds of services that you can do. So the main one being EC2, and one of the ones being EC2. And here, you know, you can go and create your own instances. So that's what I was talking about earlier. You know, just basically running some computer in the cloud. That's what EC2 is. And a lot of AWS services are built on top of EC2. The issue here is, say, you know, you want to make this infrastructure setup reproducible. How are you gonna do that? Well, I guess the most naive way would be essentially to capture a video and walk through the whole process of launching an instance, you know, the web name, the server name, setting up what your AMI is gonna be. So it's kind of, AMI is like the image. So kind of think of it as like, it's like a baked in version of your OS, like virtual machines, right? You can decide what virtual machine you're gonna use and the OS for that. That's what an AMI is. And so there's a bunch of settings here, right? And obviously, Amazon's UI changes all the time. See, even here, you can opt out of the old experience. Oh, shit. Oh. Main point being that it is not you won't have a fun time going through the steps. And when the UI changes, well, it's going to break, right? Because how do you follow on something that's already changed? And so what infrastructure as code aims to do is they aim to define your infrastructure in code, hence infrastructure as code. And the idea there is, you know, if a new developer joins, like at Scan, for example, when a new developer joins, what we can do is we can give them a script. And what that script does is it sets up the developer's own cloud environment automatically, as opposed to having to go through, you know, the video and say, oh, I'll do this, then this, then this, which is, well, fairly inefficient and not reproducible. So in saying that, that's kind of a brief overview of what infrastructure as code does. Right now in the market, there are probably 3 main solutions. I'm not well versed with Google Cloud and Azure, but with regards to AWS, so AWS has one called Cloud Development Kit. And then the most widespread one is probably Terraform. And then there's Pulumi, which is built on top of Terraform, which is the one that we're going to be using today. So with that, I am going to go into the code. So I'll give a brief overview of like what we have here. So I've just created this, I've scaffolded this project using a Create React app. And I'm not sure how many of you guys are using React, but if you were to start off with creating a React project, probably just use the Create React app CLI, because it sets up a lot of stuff for you automatically and you don't need to worry about the configurations. And it's developed by Facebook, so it's always going to be very well maintained. So what I've done here is I've created this infra folder. And so what this infra folder does is it defines the infrastructure that we're going to use to deploy our application. I'll run through this briefly. and I'll point out the main, I guess, pieces of infrastructure we're going to be setting up. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise their hand. So as I previously mentioned, so there are two main things that we need to do to be able to deploy our applications worldwide, right? There is S3, which is where we're going to be storing our web application. And then there's going to be the caching, the content delivery network, which is CloudFront. And so here, very simple, what are we doing? Here, we are defining a bucket, right? So here we can see a new AWS S3 bucket. And so this is all Pulumi, right? So this is the code that we're using to define our infrastructure. So we define a bucket here. Hey, all good. So yeah, we define a bucket. We need to attach some policies to the bucket. And without going into too much detail, essentially, regardless of the cloud provider you're using, you will need to give a resource permissions, right? And this is just to allow them, I guess it tells the cloud, who is able to access what. So because obviously you don't want everyone to be able to access your bucket because they can do whatever they want to with. So here we're just defining a public read policy for the bucket, attaching that policy to said bucket that we've defined here. And then here, this is the CloudFront distribution. So this is the content delivery network that I was talking about, which will cache your our application in all of the AWS locations. I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to this because it's a lot of boilerplate because a lot of these are just default values. But the main thing to understand here is that here what we are essentially doing is we are going to be telling AWS, hey, please set up a bucket and please set up a CloudFront for us. And then telling AWS that, hey, this CloudFront distribution is going to be associated with this bucket that we've defined up here. So you see this, we have this bucket.arn that's just referring to here. So essentially this is the line that associates the CDN with the bucket. So it tells the CDN, here is what you're going to be caching. So that's about it. And so what I'm going to do now is I am going to attempt to set up a new CDN and S3, and then we go from there. So I'm not going to bore you guys too much with the API, but essentially what we're going to do is we're going to do Pulumi new, I believe. Yes. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into this module, this infra module, and then set up what we have here. So if I can attempt to do that. Well, right. So essentially what we've done here is I've called Pulumi's API and told Pulumi, hey, I want to deploy some infrastructure into a stack. And a stack is just a set of resources that are going to be managed by Pulumi. And so in our case, the set of resources is just the S3 bucket and the CDN. So if I do Pulumi stack ls, here we can see that we're using the CISA demo stack. And then now I am going to call Pulumi's API to essentially deploy or set up this infrastructure in AWS through this Pulumi app, which hopefully will work. All right, so if we, let's look here. So here we can see that essentially what Pulumi is doing, it's getting ready, it's looking at our code, and it's seeing what it has to do. And then so you see here, well, what is it doing? It's setting up a whole bunch of resources that we've defined in our index.ts essentially. And so this is probably going to take a while. So I guess I've just went through a lot of stuff. And it's going to probably take 4 or 5 minutes for us to deploy everything onto the cloud. So in the interim, are there any questions, queries, concerns? No? All right.
What scan uses as well?
That's right. Yeah. In fact, I would believe that most tech companies, if they are deploying a React application if they're moving off kind of a platform as a service like Heroku or something, this is usually what they would do. Obviously, with very big tech companies, they manage their own infrastructure, like they use Kubernetes to probably start serving their web pages. But in the interim, so they will probably use S3 and CloudFront, because S3 and CloudFront essentially it allows you to scale, and you don't have to handle the scaling yourself, and it gives you enough configuration to decide, what am I going to cache? How do I cache it? What's the time to live? And stuff like that. Yeah, so it's probably going to take a while. But the good thing is I do have something already set up. So this has to load. All right. So you can see here that this here you can see it's deploying. This is what we just tried to deploy with Pulumi. So if I split the screen here, essentially this deployment here is what we just tried to do. So I've done one yesterday. So what does CloudFront give you? Well, CloudFront essentially, it gives you this, it manages all of the SSL for you. So it makes sure that you can't access your website through HTTP. It must go through HTTPS. And it handles a lot of this stuff that you usually don't want to handle, because if you do it yourself, you're probably going to introduce a lot of security flaws. So CloudFront just does that all for you, and then it essentially gives you this CloudFront link. And if I access this link, you say it's hello. So if I go here and now app.js, you can see that this is the version I just deployed. It says hello. And if anyone accesses this link, they will be able to see the hello. So what we can do after this is, that's great, right? So we have something set up, and everyone can access it. It's distributed, it's scalable, and it most likely won't go down because AWS is managing all the server behind it. So then how can we, I guess, deploy to this? Or how did I deploy? Because this takes a long time. So how did we deploy something onto this, this edge location? So that is essentially done through just uploading into the S3 bucket. So if I am able to, all right. So here, I've built the application inside this build folder. Oh, it's done. All right, maybe I'll start from here. So, okay. Sorry, the confusion is, but zoom out. So we can see that this CloudFront that we've just set up is done. So now everything's distributed into cloud. But if we try to access it, we can see that it's probably, well, it's not going to give us anything, right? And why is that the reason? Well, it's because we haven't actually put anything into the S3 bucket yet. Which was what I was about to do here. So what we can do is let's try and put something into the S3 bucket. So let's go here, the resources. Sorry for the switching. Sorry for the screen switching, guys. So here. So here we see we've set up a stack called CSET demo. And all we need to do is we need to go to the resources and to find our bucket name. Right, so here we have the bucket name. And all we're going to do is we are going to, again, locally upload our built package into the S3 bucket. So that's what I'm doing here. So this command, so essentially we're using AWS CLI here. And it's all we're saying is, hey, please use this profile in AWS. Please sync the build folder into this bucket here. So like upload the build folder into the root of the bucket. And if we do that, it says the build doesn't exist. That's great. All right. So if I do this, cool. All right. So now essentially what we've done is we've uploaded everything, the build folder into S3. So if we go here to S3 now, we should be able to see. So has to load 5E. D9B. So here, so this is the bucket that we've just set up with Pulumi, and we've just uploaded everything, the build folder into the root bucket here. So everything here, we just uploaded here. And then if we go to reload this page in CloudFront, hopefully this is gonna load the hello, but no promises. And I think it's loading. All right, okay, didn't load the hello, but it loaded, sorry, I guess I didn't rebuild it, but essentially this is loading this code here, right? So I framed one of our share links into what we're deploying into the cloud. So essentially what we've done here is this is the code that we've deployed, and you can see that, you know, this web application is now deployed throughout the whole world, and it's cached. Now, if we want to say change it, right? So here I say I want to go back to the hello. What am I going to do? I'm going to comment this out, go here, and then I will rebuild the application. So yarn build, and so that will build this here. Cool, it's done. And then I'm going to deploy everything. So I'm going to recopy this build folder into S3 again. And that should. So it's going to take some time for the CloudFront to propagate because this is cached, right? So it's going to take some time for the cache to refresh. I can't do this. Give me a sec. So what I can do is, so the reason why this page is not refreshing is because essentially AWS has deployed everything on the edge locations, right? Now, when we deploy something new, AWS doesn't know yet. And so there's this thing called time to live, which essentially is telling AWS, hey, how often should you check the source of truth, which is our S3 bucket, right? So which is why right now we're not seeing, even though we deployed something, we're still seeing the old version. But what we can do is we can create what is known as an invalidation. And so what an invalidation does is it forces CloudFront to get the data again from S3. So after we do that, hopefully this hello should be there. So give me a sec. Fetch my distribution ID. All right, so we've created invalidation, which means that hopefully if I come back here and reload the page, I get hello. And so that essentially is how you tell AWS, hey, I've deployed a new version. Please get rid of the cache that you have at the edge locations and refetch what you have in S3. And that's basically it. So I guess we can take it a step further, which is to introduce to be able to do this all in an automated way, right? So obviously, you don't want to be doing this manually every time you deploy. If you have 10 people trying to deploy, like it doesn't make a lot of sense. And you usually don't want to give permissions to all the developers to be able to access and, deploy whatever they want onto your web. So to take it a step further, what you can do is you can then integrate what we just did so far, right? So for example, building your code, deploying your code onto AWS or S3, and then creating an invalidation to tell AWS, hey, please fetch the new version of the code. You can do that all in your CI. And so I don't think we have time to go through it because it's going to take some time for the CI to run, but essentially that is what this is doing here, right? So it essentially did everything I did just then, right? So what's the first step? So we're saying, hey, when you merge your code into master, what are you going to do? Well, okay, you're going to build your application like we just did, and then you're going to deploy to S3, which is what we just did, right? So this deploy to S3, all it does underneath the hood here is just your AWS S3 sync. So that's all it's doing here. And then lastly, it says, hey, please invalidate the CloudFront location. So that's essentially what we just did here with your AWS CloudFront create invalidation. And then once you do that, it finishes running, and then boom, you're going to have a new version of your web app. Yeah, I think that's basically it.
Anyone have any questions? I have one.
Yeah.
Like, how long do you think it takes to get good at, or how do you get good at managing stuff on the cloud as a beginner? Because doing all this kind of seems like diving into the deep end.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry for that, guys. I mean, yeah. I think it's more of an organizational issue than it is, I guess, a developer one. Well, it depends on the scale of your company, right? So, in big companies, they have people literally just dedicated to setting up infrastructure. And then so the workflow there would be a developer says, hey, please set up a CloudFront formation, please set up a CloudFront with S3 for me. And then these are the permissions I need. This is how long I need to be cached for. And then the infra team would be like, okay, cool, I've done this. You can deploy it with these credentials, right? If you're a smaller company, like you're a startup, usually you just have each project, or how we do STN is you have each project manage its own infrastructure so that the boundaries are clear. And then for infrastructure that is going to be used across different projects, you have this kind of root repository which everyone can reference. So a common thing is when you have microservices, like at Scan, we have multiple different backends. They all communicate through events, SNS and SQS. So what we do there is we have a repository that just has the SQS and SNS, and then everyone can then reference it, and everyone can just say, hey, I want to listen to this event. I want to listen, and I want to use this queue, for example. And that's how we currently manage it. But depends on the size of the organization. It depends on how you want to structure the process. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's about it. But I'm sorry if maybe this is like a bit of a deep dive into how everything is set up. But I'm really keen to hear, how you guys are thinking of deploying stuff into the cloud, or if that's not something you guys have thought about yet, because I think it's about week 3 and everyone leaves their projects until the last week. Yeah, or is this completely foreign, or do we need more context? I'm happy to kind of take a step back and talk everyone through, how to get to this location and like what you'd probably start off with if you were deploying your own React application. Or it doesn't have to be React, any application deploying to the cloud. No takers?
Should we do like a hands up of like how familiar you are with?
Is it too much of a deep dive like this, or is it like not enough context?
For me personally, I haven't interacted with the cloud a lot.
Yeah.
So even though like I understand what you're doing while you're explaining it, I wouldn't be able to reproduce it myself.
Right.
Yeah. Like you said, there was a I think there was an app you used to like that built a lot of the like structure for this. You just had to fill in.
Yes.
Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure how many of you guys have used React, but I think with any front end, it's like there's a lot of tooling involved and to getting everything transpiled correctly and like hot reloading and stuff like that. So what Facebook has done is Facebook has essentially done all of that for you. So it does all the scaffolding for you. And so all you really need to do is to do npx create React app, and it sets up everything for you, right? So hot reloading, the modules you need to use, all the Babel transpilations. So you don't need to worry about any of that, and you just start coding. So that's what I use to scaffold this project here. And then what it ends up giving you is a all it does is it just scaffolds everything, like here. So there's really three main tools that we've used here. So one is create React app to scaffold your React code. There is Pulumi, which is what interacts with AWS to set up all of your infrastructure. And then there is the AWS CLI itself, which was used to copy your build code into the S3 bucket and also to create the invalidations. Yeah.
That's all the questions I have.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions at all?
Are developers responsible for the deployment as well?
You mean at Scan personally?
Yeah.
So if you're just going in, no. You're just going, no, but after you kind of get a gist of like how to set everything up, then if you're saying, hey, I want to create a new project, so usually we do micro front end. So you're saying, hey, I want this little piece I want this new page to be integrated into the main application. Then yeah, we have a kind of template set up already that they can just pull down, and which does everything here, and then you have a script that runs it automatically. Yeah.
In terms of like using cloud, because I'm sure a lot of companies are now moving like their servers and stuff on cloud.
Yeah.
How do you think a company like Scan would get an advantage on top of others when everyone else is using cloud stuff?
I guess you don't need people to manage your infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But I think there's pros and cons on that, right? So if you manage your own servers, it depends on whether what you're running on premise is like mission critical. Mm-hmm. So, you wouldn't want to host your backend by yourself if you don't have the resource. A lot of big tech companies do that, but if you're a startup, like you don't want to be up 2 a.m. in the morning trying to like restart your servers, like figure out the security updates and stuff like that, right? That's just like no one wants to do that. So In that sense, you do have an advantage because everything's managed for you. The downside is obviously the cost because everything's managed for you, they're going to charge you a premium on top of that, right? But if you're doing ML, usually if you're doing the training, like you don't want to do that in the cloud because it's just very, very expensive. So if you do, like, for example, when we do ML, we do the training locally, like on premise, and then we just deploy the model into the cloud because that has to be highly available, right? So yeah, depends on the use case. So yeah.
Since Scan is like a 3D geospatial data company, would it, like, most of what you're rendering onto the web be really huge?
It's a good question. I don't know how. I'll give a brief overview. So usually, like, yes, that would be the case, which is why you'd usually need to pre-process the data before you start to render it in the web, right? Because you can imagine, like, if the point cloud is 2 GB, you're not gonna, well, firstly, the browser won't let you load 2 gigs of stuff because it's gonna run out of memory. And secondly, no one's gonna wait to download 2 gigs of data. So what you do is you pre-process that data such that you can load it in tiles. So very similar to Google Maps. You see, you know, when you use Google Maps, when you're really far away, it renders the whole earth. And then as you go in, it refines more and more and more and more. That's basically the same thing where you tile your point cloud or mesh or whatever into something of that structure where the closer you zoom, the more refined your 3D model will get. And so that's the format called 3D tiles. But there are some other formats that are, like, for example, OBJs that just can't be tiled. And so with those, you just have to load the whole thing up into the browser. Yeah. Did you call me sir? Oh, good. Yes.
Yeah. So because I used Heroku before.
Yes.
I think it's much simpler than
Yes.
this one.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, is Heroku still, like, popular for small business, or like most companies that just switch to AWS?
A very, very good question. It depends on the traffic that you're getting into your website, I guess, right? So with Heroku, everything is super easy to deploy. Like, if you were doing like a side project, that's what I would use. But you get to a stage where if you have more and more people coming to your website, it gets very costly very fast. And so at that point, you'd most likely want to switch over to something like S3 plus CloudFront or Kubernetes, maybe. But with, I guess, if you look at the kind of industry as a whole, for the most part, the easier it is for you to do what you need to do, the more expensive it will be, and you're going to have less configuration over what you can do and you can't do, right? Whereas if you go lower down the stack, then it's going to be cheaper, but you need to deal with more of the nitty gritty. So if you take this one level further, right? So say, for example, today we want to do our own caching and we want to deploy everything by ourselves onto EC2. You can theoretically do that if you want, right? So you can deploy your EC2 instances, one in America, one in Australia, and then you set up your own kind of system to deploy and sync up your EC2 instances when something new is deployed. And big companies, they do that, right? Because maybe they need more fine-grained control than what we have in CloudFront here. So it's really what level of abstraction do you want to work at, and understanding that all abstractions are going to be leaky, and it's just how much they leak. And if you get to a state where you feel, okay, well, at this current level of abstraction I'm working at, I just don't have enough control, then you just go further down the stack, understanding that, well, it brings more pain, but you get more configuration. Yeah, a very good question.
Yeah, forget that.
Yeah, sorry, I think this was a bit, I wasn't sure of the kind of like how much context I needed to provide. So I kind of felt like it was kind of too much a dive into the deep end. So yeah, like I want to reiterate, if there's anything that's just not clear or you feel like you want me to go into more detail about, I'm happy to do that.